You think black families in the 1960s only knew fried chicken and collard greens? Think again. Every week, kitchens across America served meals that have quietly disappeared from our tables and our memories. Here are 60 forgotten meals every black family ate weekly. Salmon croquettes and rice were a weekday staple that stretched one can into a feast. The salmon was mixed with onions, eggs, and cornmeal, shaped into patties, and fried until golden and crisp at the edges. The outside crunched, the inside stayed soft, rich, and savory. Served over a scoop of hot rice and drizzled with hot sauce, it became a dish that felt special, no matter how often it appeared. It was a cook's answer to tight budgets and big appetites. The scent filled kitchens with comfort, the sizzling sound in the pan like a promise of something good coming soon. Grandmothers made them on Fridays, mothers packed them in lunch boxes, and everyone knew they were good cold too. It was food with rhythm, steady, reliable, and full of flavor. Salmon croquettes and rice were more than just a meal. They were proof that care, creativity, and a can of fish could make magic on any table. Grease bread sandwiches were a no-frills lunch that made the most of every scrap left from cooking. After frying meat like bacon or salt pork, the leftover drippings were spread onto bread, sometimes sprinkled with a little salt or pepper. The result was a sandwich that was greasy, salty, and filling enough to tide someone over until dinner. Housewives relied on it because it wasted nothing, stretching even the smallest amount of meat into another meal. Children sometimes enjoyed it for its richness, though it was not always seen as a treat, while adults accepted it as a quick way to satisfy hunger. Grease bread sandwiches reflected the wartime and Depression-era mentality of using every resource to its fullest. Though far from glamorous, they carried both nourishment and necessity in their simplicity. Today they have nearly disappeared, but once they were a symbol of thrift and survival in African American kitchens. Molasses-glazed chicken wings gave lunch boxes and picnic tables a sticky sweetness that clung to every fingertip. The wings were marinated overnight in a blend of dark molasses, garlic, and a touch of ground mustard before being baked until the glaze turned glossy and caramelized. As they roasted, the molasses thickened into a deep amber coating that locked in the juices and perfumed the kitchen with a warm, almost smoky scent. Families packed these wings in foil for school lunches or road trips, where they stayed moist and flavorful even when served at room temperature. Children loved the candy-like glaze, while adults appreciated the subtle spice and satisfying chew. In many African American households of the 1970s, these wings became a dependable treat for church picnics and weekend outings, offering the perfect mix of frugality and indulgence. Eating them meant licking every finger clean and reaching for one more piece even when the basket seemed empty. A memory that lingers long after the last bite. Saltfish cakes carried the flavor of the sea into inland kitchens and proved that preserved ingredients could create unforgettable lunches. Dried salt cod was soaked overnight until tender, then flaked into a bowl of mashed potatoes, chopped onions, and fresh parsley before being shaped into small patties. Each cake was pan-fried in hot lard until the outside turned a deep golden brown and the inside stayed soft and briny. Families valued these cakes for their long shelf life and the ability to travel well without refrigeration, making them ideal for picnics, fieldwork, or school lunches. Grandparents remember how the salty aroma filled the house as the cake sizzled in the skillet and how a squeeze of lemon or a spoonful of homemade relish brightened every bite. Served with simple greens or a slice of cornbread, these fish cakes turned humble pantry staples into something both hearty and elegant. They remain a symbol of resourcefulness and coastal tradition, a recipe that brought the ocean's taste to every table no matter how far from the shore. Molasses rice was one of the simplest and most reliable meals families leaned on when sugar, meat, and other staples were out of reach. Mothers cooked a pot of plain white rice until it was soft and steaming, then spooned it into bowls while it was still piping hot. A drizzle of molasses, thick, dark, and deeply flavored, was poured over the top, sinking into every grain. The sweetness was rich enough to feel like a treat, even though it came from a bottle that lasted far longer than sugar ever could. Children stirred their bowls until the rice turned a warm caramel color, tasting the comforting blend of sweet and earthy notes. Some added a little butter if the house had any, making it even richer. The dish carried enough calories to keep hunger quiet for hours, which was essential during the toughest weeks. Nothing about it felt cheap to a child. It tasted warm, familiar, and honest. Molasses rice was a bowl of survival disguised as something close to dessert. It allowed. Everyone from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent took comfort in its familiar taste. Long after the holidays, people remembered how rice pudding made the house smell like cinnamon and hope. Sweet rice pudding with raisins tasted like warmth, resourcefulness, and Christmas sweetness created from almost nothing. Chicken and dumplings holiday pot was the dish that wrapped Christmas in warmth, especially in homes where money was tight and hearts were full. Mothers simmered chicken pieces, sometimes wings, backs, or necks, in a large pot with onions and celery until the broth grew rich and fragrant. Then came the dumplings, soft dough dropped by spoonful into the bubbling pot. They puffed as they cooked, soaking up all the flavor until each dumpling tasted buttery, tender, and soothing. Children loved lifting the lid to watch the dumplings dance in the steam, begging for the first bowl even when they knew it needed more time. When served, the dish felt like a warm blanket in food form, thick, hearty, and perfect for winter nights. Mothers made chicken and dumplings because it stretched modest ingredients into enough to feed a crowd, leaving no one hungry. Each spoonful tasted like comfort built through slow cooking and patient hands. Even years later, adults remembered the steam fogging the windows, the sound of the bubbling pot, and the quiet moment when the first dumpling broke open on their tongue. Chicken and dumplings tasted like holiday love large enough to fill a room. Crab cakes formed into mini patties were seafood luxury that made Thanksgiving feel extra special. The sweet crab meat mixed with breadcrumbs and seasonings before being pan-fried until golden. Grandmothers would pick through cans of crab meat to remove any shell pieces, then gently fold the delicate meat with beaten eggs, breadcrumbs, mayonnaise, mustard, Old Bay seasoning, and sometimes diced bell peppers. The mixture was formed into small patties, each one handled carefully, then refrigerated briefly to help them hold together during cooking. The crab cakes were pan-fried in butter until golden brown on both sides, the exterior developing a crispy crust while the interior stayed moist and packed with sweet crab flavor. In the 1970s, Black households, crab cakes represented coastal sophistication, bringing seafood traditions to holiday tables and elevating the appetizer spread. Children loved mini crab cakes because they felt fancy, tasted sweet rather than fishy, and came in sizes perfect for young appetites. Fried green tomatoes were a porch-side favorite, a snack for hot days and easy laughter. Slices of firm green tomatoes were dipped in cornmeal, fried golden in a skillet, and sprinkled with salt while still sizzling. The result was crisp on the outside, soft inside, and just tart enough to make your mouth water. You could eat them standing up, still hot from the pan, or stack them high beside a plate of beans and rice. They were the kind of treat you didn't plan, you just made them when the garden gave too many tomatoes. The pop of oil, the hum of conversation, and the smell of cornmeal frying turned an ordinary afternoon into something special. Kids waited by the stove, stealing pieces when the cook wasn't looking, their fingers burned but happy. Fried green tomatoes weren't just about taste, they were about time, patience, and community. Their taste was bold but humble, a reminder of summers that felt endless and simple pleasures that cost almost nothing. Fried green tomatoes were living proof that good things come to those who cook from the heart. Okra and tomato stew was a garden-born staple that thrived in warm southern summers when vegetables were plentiful. Fresh okra pods, picked before they grew tough, were sliced and simmered with ripe tomatoes, onions, and bell peppers until the flavors melded into a thick, savory stew. The okra's natural thickening quality gave the dish a comforting, almost silky texture, while the tomatoes added tang and brightness. Seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a hint of smoked meat for depth, this was a dish that could stand alone with cornbread or be served alongside fish or chicken. In African American kitchens, it was a way to make the most of backyard gardens and stretch a small amount of meat into a filling meal. It could be made entirely vegetarian or enriched with bits of bacon or ham hock, depending on what was available. The beauty of okra and tomato stew lay in its adaptability. Each household had its own variation, often influenced by what was growing just outside the kitchen door. Though it remains known in some southern homes, its presence has faded as fresh garden cooking has become less common in everyday life. Peach cobbler with biscuit topping was the heart of many summer evenings in African-American homes of the 1970s, a dessert that tasted like sunshine caught in a pan. Juicy peaches were tossed with brown sugar, lemon juice, and a whisper of cinnamon until their natural syrup began to bubble. Over this golden fruit, a blanket of soft biscuit dough was dropped in spoonfuls, each one browning to a tender crust as the oven worked its magic. The scent of warm fruit and butter drifted through open windows, calling neighbors to stop by for a plate. Served with a drizzle of fresh cream or a scoop of homemade ice cream, every bite balanced tart peach with sweet, flaky topping. Families loved how the cobbler came together from simple pantry staples yet felt luxurious enough for company. It carried the legacy of Southern kitchens into a modern decade, proving that when peaches are ripe and the air is warm, nothing brings people together faster than the promise of a bubbling pan of cobbler shared straight from the oven. Apple brown. Betty brought Depression-era thrift. Wild grape must connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and Scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape must stand as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African-American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia.
Skillet might sound like something you'd say while sneezing, but it was once one of the sweetest roots in the patch. Grown in colder climates and cultivated in neat rows, this starchy vegetable produced clusters of thin, white roots that were naturally sugary. So sweet, in fact, they were sometimes eaten raw. Indigenous gardeners in northern regions prized skillet for its flavor and adaptability. It could be roasted, boiled, mashed, or made into fritters and stews, its taste falling somewhere between carrot and parsnip with a smooth, creamy texture. But as maize agriculture spread and corn began dominating both fields and diets, skillet fell out of favor. It just didn't scale like corn, nor did it compete with the growing number of introduced crops. But before skillet slipped away, another seasonal player showed up every spring, bearing fruit that had to be timed just right.
Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Brown butter green beans were the kind of Christmas side dish that brought elegance to the table without costing more than a handful of coins. Black mothers in the 1960s knew how to elevate simple vegetables with nothing but time, seasoning, and a patient hand at the skillet. They simmered the beans until they softened, then added butter to the pan, letting it melt and deepen into a nutty brown that scented the entire kitchen. That butter clung to every bean, turning something plain into something rich and irresistible. Children might not have known why these beans tasted different, but they knew they loved them. The dish balanced softness and flavor, proving that holiday meals were not about money, but about intention and skill. Brown butter green beans often sat beside ham, chicken, dressing, or whatever the family could afford that year, acting as a steady, comforting anchor to the plate. Mothers appreciated how far the dish could stretch, filling bowls without straining the pantry. Families gathered around the table, taking generous spoonfuls because the flavor tasted deeper than a simple vegetable had any right to taste. Even long after childhood ended, people remembered the nuttiness, the shine, and the warmth that rose from the pan on Christmas afternoon. Brown butter green beans tasted like thrift turned into luxury, one careful stir at a time. Fried cornmeal mush was the kind of breakfast or dinner that stretched leftovers into something new. Leftover cornmeal mush was poured into a pan to chill overnight, becoming firm enough to slice. Mothers cut it into rectangles and fried them in a hot skillet until each piece turned golden and crisp on the outside. The inside stayed soft and warm, a perfect contrast in texture. Children topped the slices with syrup or butter if the house had any, but even plain, the cakes were filling and delicious. Some families sprinkled a little sugar on top, turning the meal into a treat. Others served it with greens or beans, making it part of a larger dinner. It was a meal built from yesterday's scraps, but enjoyed like something special. Fried cornmeal mush was proof that nothing needed to go to waste. Molasses-glazed sweet potato wedges offered a gentle sweetness that brightened even the most ordinary midday meal. Fresh sweet potatoes were sliced into thick wedges, brushed with sorghum or dark molasses, and roasted until the natural sugars caramelized into a sticky glaze. A pinch of cinnamon and a splash of apple cider vinegar balanced the rich sweetness with a subtle tang, filling the kitchen with a warm autumn aroma. Families prized this dish because it required little more than a backyard harvest of potatoes and a jar of pantry syrup, yet tasted indulgent enough for Sunday gatherings. Grandparents recall how the edges crisped to a delicate chew while the centers stayed soft and almost creamy, making each bite a small celebration. These wedges were often paired with fried chicken or simply served alongside a bowl of beans and greens, adding both color and comfort to the plate. Even today, the memory of that molasses shine and the slow roasting smell can bring a wave of nostalgia to anyone who grew up with Southern kitchens. Catfish nuggets with corn relish turned community festivals into a feast of golden bites that everyone wanted to sample. Fresh catfish was cut into small chunks, seasoned with black pepper and a hint of cayenne, then dredged in cornmeal before a quick fry in hot oil. The nuggets came out crisp on the outside and tender inside, easy to eat with fingers while wandering through crowded fairgrounds. A bright corn relish made from sweet kernels, diced peppers, and a splash of cider vinegar offered a cool contrast to the hot fish. Vendors served the nuggets in paper trays lined with newspaper so the juices would soak in without making a mess. In the 1970s, these little pieces of fish were the highlight of summer gatherings across the South and Midwest, where the smell of frying catfish traveled down streets and drew neighbors from blocks away. They were inexpensive, full of flavor, and perfect for sharing, which made them more than just a snack. They became a social event all by themselves. Vegetable chow chow sandwiches were one of the thriftiest lunches found in African American homes. Chow chow, a tangy relish made from cabbage, peppers, onions, and green tomatoes, was chopped finely and preserved in jars. Spread thickly on bread, it became a quick sandwich filling that was sharp, colorful, and inexpensive. Families often made chow chow during the summer harvest, ensuring jars lined the pantry shelves for the year ahead. When meat was unavailable or too costly, chow chow sandwiches provided a burst of flavor that made plain bread into a meal. Children might have found the relish too strong, but adults appreciated its tang and variety. The sandwiches carried both the taste of summer gardens and the practicality of preservation, reflecting how African American kitchens stretched harvests through the seasons. Today, chow chow is rarely remembered outside of Southern cooking, but once vegetable chow chow sandwiches were a resourceful and flavorful way to keep lunch simple yet satisfying. Rice and gravy plates were the leftover miracle of Sunday dinners. When the roast was gone, the gravy stayed, a pot of flavor too precious to waste. Poured over warm rice, it became a whole new meal, rich and soothing. The taste was deep and slow, made from drippings, onions, and patience. It stretched one meal into three, a small victory in homes where nothing was thrown away. The smell filled kitchens with familiarity, that savory perfume of comfort and continuity. Children learned to love it early, scraping plates clean to catch every last drop. For working families, rice and gravy were a reminder that resourcefulness could taste like luxury. It was not just food. It was a memory reheated, a symbol of care and cleverness. Rice and gravy plates were proof that love could be poured, ladled, and served one spoonful at a time. Red beans and rice with andouille filled kitchens with a slow, simmered aroma that promised comfort long before lunchtime arrived. Dry red beans soaked overnight were cooked with onions, celery, and bell peppers, known as the holy trinity of Creole cooking. Spicy andouille sausage lent a deep, smoky flavor that seasoned every grain of rice beneath the beans. Families often set a pot to cook in the morning so it would be ready when school and work breaks came, and the meal could easily stretch to feed whoever showed up hungry. In the 1970s, this dish served as a weekly ritual, often enjoyed on Mondays when leftovers from Sunday's dinner found new life in the pot. Served with a wedge of cornbread, it carried the traditions of Louisiana into kitchens from Chicago to Houston. Its balance of spice, warmth, and steady nourishment made it more than a meal. It was a shared experience of culture and community that everyone wanted back. Boiled okra and rice bowls were one of the simplest midday meals, stripped down to nothing but essentials. Fresh okra pods were boiled until soft, then spooned generously over hot rice with a little salt and sometimes a splash of hot sauce or vinegar. The texture was slippery and not to everyone's taste, but the dish filled stomachs when little else was available. Housewives leaned on it because okra and rice were cheap and easy to prepare quickly, making it a dependable option when other ingredients were scarce. Children sometimes turned their noses up at the sliminess, but many grew up with it as a familiar part of daily life. Adults appreciated the steady nourishment and the ease of cooking something so simple. Though plain compared to other lunches, boiled okra and rice represented survival and thrift, proving that even the most basic foods could sustain families through lean times. Today it is nearly forgotten, but once it was a staple. Cornbread and potlikker was a meal born from resourcefulness and cherished for its ability to turn scraps into something deeply nourishing. After collard or turnip greens finished cooking, the leftover broth in the pot was never wasted. That liquid, known as potlikker, held vitamins, minerals, and the smoky taste of the pork scraps that flavored the greens. Mothers poured the potlikker into bowls, then crumbled hot cornbread straight into it, letting the bread soak until it softened into a thick, hearty mixture children loved, stirring it together, watching the cornbread break apart and absorb the warm broth. The flavor was rich, salty, and comforting in a way that felt larger than the ingredients themselves. It was a meal that filled empty stomachs, soothed tired bodies, and gave families strength to face the next day. Cornbread and potlikker was survival wisdom passed down through generations. Stewed cabbage with onions and pepper was the kind of Christmas side dish that proved you did not need expensive ingredients to make something delicious and comforting. Black mothers in the 1960s knew how to coax flavor out of the simplest vegetables, turning cabbage into a dish that warmed the whole table. They sliced the cabbage into soft ribbons, letting it fall into a pot with onions, a little oil, and black pepper that bloomed the moment it touched the heat. As it simmered, the cabbage softened slowly, absorbing every bit of flavor until the whole pot smelled humble and familiar in the best way. Children might not have rushed toward cabbage the way they rushed toward pie or ham, but they always scooped some onto their plates because mothers seasoned it so well. Stewed cabbage was tender, savory, and soothing, the kind of dish you paired with anything else on the plate. It was a reminder that holiday food did not need to be fancy to carry meaning. It stretched far, fed many, and tasted like home cooking shaped by patience and love. Even families with tight budgets could rely on this dish to fill the table without sacrifice. Years later, people who grew up with it remember the gentle aroma, the way steam rose from the pot, and the feeling of being cared for by hands that always made the most of what they had. Stewed cabbage with onions and pepper tasted like comfort, resourcefulness, and the quiet heart of Christmas dinner. Cowpea soup simmered like a prayer whispered over a fire. The pot would start with water, a scoop of dried field peas, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the week had been kind. Onions and garlic joined in, releasing their scent as the broth thickened into something golden and strong. The cowpeas, small and sturdy, softened slowly, their flavor deepening with every hour. This wasn't fast food, it was patient food, built on rhythm and time. Families made it during harvest, when work was hard and hands needed warmth. It was ladled into tin bowls and passed around without ceremony, each bite grounding you in gratitude. Sometimes cornbread floated on top like an offering, soaking up the last drops of broth. The soup tasted of earth and labor, of simple things done well. Cowpea soup was both meal and memory, tying together generations who had learned how to make plenty out of little. It was food for body and spirit alike, humble but whole, strong but soothing. Even now, its scent carries the same promise, that comfort comes from what you give, not what you have. Crackling bread transformed pork scraps into cornbread so rich it could serve as a meal on its own. Cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard from pork fat, were considered waste by some but treasure by black cooks who understood their value. These crunchy, savory morsels were mixed directly into cornmeal batter along with buttermilk, salt, and just enough flour to bind everything together. The batter was poured into smoking hot cast iron skillets greased with lard, then baked until the bottom turned dark golden and crispy. Each bite delivered cornmeal's earthy sweetness punctuated by bursts of porky crunch, creating textural contrasts that made plain bread feel special. In Mississippi, Delta communities, and rural Alabama, crackling bread appeared whenever hogs were slaughtered, ensuring every part of the animal fed someone. The bread was substantial enough to be breakfast, lunch, or dinner, often eaten with nothing but a glass of buttermilk or potlikker from greens. Children carried wedges of crackling bread in their pockets to school, the fat keeping them full through long days with resourceful hands. Collard greens with potlikker was a dish where nothing went to waste and flavor reigned supreme. Collard greens were simmered for hours with smoked pork or turkey, allowing their sturdy leaves to soften and absorb the rich, savory essence of the meat. The resulting broth, known as potlikker, was a nutrient-packed liquid treasured as much as the greens themselves. Served with cornbread for dipping, it was both meal and sustenance, especially in lean times. In African American cooking, this was more than just a side. It was a way to nourish the body fully, drawing on traditions of resourcefulness passed down through generations. Potlikker was even believed to have restorative qualities, making it a home remedy as well as a culinary staple. The flavor was deep, smoky, and satisfying, with the greens offering a balance of bitterness and earthiness. While collard greens remain a symbol of Southern cooking, the reverence for potlikker has faded, leaving behind a tradition worth remembering for its taste and history alike. Meringue pie brought a touch of elegance to African American dinner tables of the 1970s, its glossy peaks of toasted meringue hiding a silky chocolate custard beneath. The filling began with whole milk warmed slowly on the stove, blended with sugar, cocoa powder, and egg yolks until it thickened to a rich, velvety texture. A flaky homemade crust provided the base, sturdy enough to cradle the warm chocolate without becoming soggy. Once poured and cooled slightly, the pie was crowned with a cloud of whipped egg whites sweetened with sugar, carefully spread to the edges to seal the filling. A few minutes in the oven turned the meringue golden brown, creating a dessert that shimmered like a jewel when brought to the table. Each slice revealed the satisfying contrast of airy topping and decadent center, a harmony of textures that delighted guests at Sunday dinners and church socials. Chocolate meringue pie was both comfort and celebration, a showpiece that proved skill and love in every bite. Prune upside-down cake offered a moist, gently spiced reward for families who valued thrift as much as hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and old-world methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Okra and tomato stew was the kind of meal that felt alive. Okra sliced thin and tomatoes stewed soft came together in a pot that bubbled quietly through the afternoon. A little onion, a pinch of salt, maybe some smoked meat if you had it. And that was all it needed. The flavor was tangy, fresh, and warm, tasting of gardens and sunshine. Poured over rice or grits, it made a full meal out of almost nothing. Families gathered around the stove to stir and talk, the smell filling the house with comfort. Okra and tomato stew was resourcefulness turned delicious, proof that the simplest meals often carried the most love. It was the taste of summer preserved in every bite, a dish that tied kitchen to field and hand to harvest. When the garden overflowed, nothing went to waste. Each tomato and pod had purpose. It was humble, but it was proud, a reflection of communities that thrived on sharing and care. A bowl of okra and tomatoes wasn't just food, it was legacy, simmered long and served with laughter. Pokeweed greens with cornbread were a survival lunch that carried caution as well as nourishment. Young pokeweed shoots, carefully harvested before they grew toxic, were boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness and danger. Once tender, they were seasoned lightly and served alongside cornbread for a meal that was simple yet filling. Foraging pokeweed required knowledge passed through families, since picking it at the wrong stage could be harmful. Housewives valued it because it was free food gathered from the land, while cornbread turned it into a complete meal. Children rarely enjoyed the bitter taste, but adults accepted it as a dependable option when money or supplies were scarce. It was a dish that spoke to resilience and the close relationship between people and the land. Today, pokeweed greens are largely forgotten, but once they were an important reminder that survival often meant making the most of what nature provided, even when risky. Sweet pepper and onion hoagies turned the aroma of a backyard garden into a hearty sandwich that could satisfy the hungriest appetite. Strips of red and green peppers were sautéed slowly in bacon fat until soft and slightly caramelized, then joined by sliced onions that absorbed every drop of smoky flavor. The mixture was piled onto crusty hoagie rolls still warm from the bakery and finished with a swipe of homemade mustard or a thin layer of melted cheese when families had some to spare. Each bite combined sweet vegetables and savory drippings in a way that tasted far richer than the short list of ingredients suggested. These hoagies were sold from small corner stores and food carts in city neighborhoods where the smell of sizzling peppers drew lines down the sidewalk. In the 1970s, they became a quick lunch for workers and students alike, proof that a simple sandwich could feel like a feast. People still talk about the scent that hung in the air long after the last pepper left the pan. Fried chitterlings bites offered a bold flavor and a crispy texture that rewarded those willing to put in the work of cleaning and preparing them. Chitterlings, or pig intestines, were meticulously washed, boiled until tender, and then cut into bite-sized pieces. These pieces were seasoned with salt, pepper, and a hint of cayenne before being dredged in cornmeal and dropped into hot oil. The result was a snack or lunch with a golden crunch and a rich, savory interior. Families valued this dish because it used every part of the animal, honoring a tradition of waste-nothing cooking. Grandparents remember entire mornings spent cleaning chitterlings while stories and laughter filled the kitchen, making the process a communal event. Served with hot sauce or a splash of vinegar, these bites were both a treat and a testament to resilience. The strong, distinctive aroma might surprise modern diners, but for those who grew up with it, fried chitterlings are a beloved reminder of resourceful cooking and shared family heritage. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the meal that proved nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. After cooking meat, mothers saved the browned bits and leftover grease from the bottom of the skillet. With a bit of flour, water, and patient stirring, those drippings transformed into a smooth, savory gravy that tasted like far more than it cost. Poured over fresh rice, the gravy turned a plain bowl into a full dinner that kept children satisfied for hours. The smell of the gravy thickening was enough to bring everyone to the table early. Some nights, mothers added onions or a pinch of seasoning if they had it, deepening the flavor even more. Other nights, it was nothing but drippings and water, yet still tasted like comfort. Children learned early that gravy night meant nobody would go hungry. It was simple, filling, and reliable, the kind of meal that made hard days feel a little easier. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the quiet hero of many 1960s kitchens. Salmon croquettes with lemon were the Christmas treat families made when fresh fish was far too expensive, proving once again that Black mothers in the 1960s could create celebration from whatever they had. Canned salmon was cheap, dependable, and always waiting in the cupboard for special meals. Mothers mixed it with breadcrumbs, onions, eggs, and seasoning, shaping patties that sizzled the moment they hit the hot skillet. The outside crisped into a golden shell while the inside stayed tender, savory, and full of comforting flavor. A squeeze of lemon over the top made the croquettes taste bright and festive, like something far fancier than their ingredients suggested. Children begged for them as soon as the smell filled the house, crowding the kitchen doorway and asking how much longer until they were ready. These croquettes felt like a gift, especially when paired with rice, grits, greens, or dressing. Mothers loved the dish because it stretched a single can into enough patties for several children, filling stomachs without draining the holiday budget. Every bite tasted like care seasoned with creativity. Years later, adults remembered the crisp edges, the steam rising from the center, and the little splash of lemon that made the flavors sing. Salmon croquettes with lemon tasted like celebration crafted from skill, not cost. Asparagus wrapped in ham created elegant finger food that introduced children to vegetables they might not try otherwise, the salty ham making the asparagus taste less intimidating. Mothers would blanch fresh asparagus spears briefly in boiling water until they turned bright green and became slightly tender, then plunge them into ice water. Each asparagus spear was then wrapped with a thin slice of deli ham, sometimes spread with cream cheese or mustard first for extra flavor. The wrapped spears were arranged on serving platters, sometimes secured with toothpicks if the ham wouldn't stay wrapped. In Black households during the 1970s, asparagus wrapped in ham represented sophistication borrowed from magazine recipes, appetizers that looked impressive enough for special occasions. Children loved them because the ham provided familiar salty flavor, while the asparagus added crunch and color, making vegetables feel like treats rather than obligations. Syrup bread emerged as the answer when there was nothing to eat but flour and whatever sweetener could be found. Sorghum syrup or molasses, cheaper than sugar and available throughout the South, were drizzled over plain biscuits or cornbread to create something approaching dessert. Black children learned to make this treat themselves, mixing flour and water into simple doughs, baking them quickly, then drowning the results in dark, sticky sweetness. The combination provided quick energy. carbohydrates from bread and concentrated sugars from syrup, delivering calories needed for labor. In sharecropping families, syrup bread appeared frequently because sorghum was often the only sweetener accessible when white landowners controlled access to refined sugar. The practice taught children to find joy in small pleasures, turning basic ingredients into treats through imagination and willingness to make something from nothing. Women sometimes added a little butter or lard to the bread if available, creating richness that complemented syrup's sweetness through ingenious adaptation. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself, and if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Fried peach. Hand pies were the portable sweets that filled church bazaars and summer block parties with the irresistible smell of hot pastry and fruit. Fresh peaches were simmered with sugar and a hint of cinnamon until they formed a thick golden filling. Circles of dough were spooned with the peach mixture, folded into half moons, and sealed with careful crimping. Each pie was fried until the crust blistered into a crisp golden shell, locking in the syrupy fruit. Children lined up for them, eager to hold the warm treats wrapped in paper towels that quickly soaked through with fragrant juices. Adults carried them home for late-night snacks or slipped them into lunchboxes for the next day. In the 1970s, these pies represented community and craftsmanship, transforming a seasonal fruit into a handheld dessert that needed no plate or fork. Fried peach hand pies brought a festival feeling to ordinary days, turning simple ingredients into something joyfully decadent and wonderfully portable. Blackberry dumplings turned backyard harvests into a dessert that captured the deep wild plum. Chutney offered a burst of tart sweetness when sugar was scarce and fruit trees grew untended along plantation edges. Gatherers picked the small, deeply colored plums at peak ripeness and simmered them slowly with a little honey or molasses when available, along with wild herbs for spice. The result was a tangy preserve that enlivened cornbread, salted meats, or simple porridge, providing vitamins and variety in otherwise plain meals. This method of combining fruit with savory seasonings echoed West African chutneys and relishes, demonstrating a culinary bridge between continents. After freedom, African-American home cooks continued to prize wild plums for jellies and sauces, and many Southern families still make small-batch plum preserves each summer. The enduring appeal of wild plum chutney lies in its ability to turn overlooked fruit into a bright condiment that brightens any table. It stands as a flavorful link between survival cooking and the rich tapestry of modern Southern preserves that celebrate both heritage and the gifts of the wild landscape. Fish fry leftovers were Friday night turned into Monday's comfort. Cold whiting or catfish, fried crisp in cornmeal and left to rest overnight, made the best sandwiches come morning. Layered between soft white bread with a drizzle of hot sauce, they carried all the flavor of the weekend into the work week. Families who gathered for fish fries on porches and backyards kept the leftovers for lunch, wrapping them in paper and storing them in ice boxes. The crunch softened, the spice deepened, and the fish took on that perfect next-day flavor, cool, peppery, and familiar. It was food that carried laughter, gospel music, and stories from one day into the next. For those who worked long hours, those sandwiches were reminders of joy waiting back home. Fish fry leftovers were more than just lunch. They were yesterday's celebration turned into today's strength. They reminded everyone that food was meant to bring people together, even after the crowd had gone. The bones of the meal held memories: neighbors talking, oil popping, children laughing over lemonade. Cold fish and soft bread became the taste of belonging, a comfort that lingered long after the last bite. Turtle stew with dumplings was a rural dish that reflected both necessity and ingenuity. Turtle meat, often from snapping turtles caught in rivers or ponds, was simmered slowly with vegetables until tender. Dumplings made from flour and water were dropped into the broth, creating a hearty stew that could feed many mouths. Housewives valued the dish because turtles were free to catch and stretched into a full meal when paired with dumplings. Children were sometimes hesitant about the idea of eating turtle, but the savory stew usually won them over. Adults appreciated its richness and the way it warmed and satisfied, especially during lean seasons. Turtle stew with dumplings represented survival cooking, where every resource from the land or water could become nourishment. Today, it is almost entirely forgotten, but once it was a vital dish that showed how African American families combined ingenuity and resourcefulness with tradition and need at the lunch table. Pickled beet and egg salad added bright color to lunch tables and carried a sweet tang that lingered pleasantly on the tongue. Hard-boiled eggs were sliced and combined with sliced beets that had been pickled in vinegar, sugar, and a touch of clove until they turned a deep crimson hue. The eggs absorbed the rosy brine, creating a marbled effect that made every slice look like a work of art. A light dressing of mayonnaise and mustard balanced the acidity and gave the salad a creamy texture that paired well with simple sandwiches or crusty bread. In the 1970s, this dish appeared frequently in school cafeterias and church suppers, where its jewel-toned presentation caught every eye. It was economical, nourishing, and striking enough to feel festive without requiring expensive ingredients. Children often remembered the way the beets stained their fingers, a small sign that they had enjoyed something both playful and wholesome. This salad proved that everyday lunches could still deliver a touch of elegance and lasting flavor. Smothered pork chop biscuits combined two beloved Southern comforts into a handheld meal that satisfied even the hungriest midday appetite. Pork chops were seasoned with black pepper, dredged in flour, and pan-fried until the crust turned golden. A quick gravy made from the pan drippings, milk, and a pinch of sage was poured over the chops before they were tucked inside warm, flaky biscuits. The gravy soaked into the bread while keeping the meat tender and juicy, creating a sandwich that tasted like Sunday dinner in portable form. Families often made these in the morning and wrapped them in foil so the biscuits would stay soft until lunchtime. In the 1970s, they were a favorite at roadside diners and church bake sales where the smell of sizzling pork lured people in from blocks away. Each bite offered a harmony of buttery biscuit, savory gravy, and hearty pork that felt both indulgent and perfectly familiar, a reminder of the kitchens where love and practicality met on every plate. Charcoal grilled pork steak delivered the rich, smoky flavor of outdoor cooking to an everyday lunch. Shoulder cuts of pork, more marbled and affordable than loin, were marinated in vinegar, garlic, and a blend of garden herbs before meeting a bed of glowing hardwood coals. The slow grilling allowed fat to render and smoke to infuse every bite with a deep, rustic aroma. Families often gathered outside around makeshift pits, turning the act of cooking into a midday celebration where neighbors shared stories while the meat sizzled. The result was tender slices with crisp edges and a flavor that could never come from an indoor stove. Grandparents remember these cookouts as community events where everyone brought a side dish, from collard greens to cornbread, creating a table that felt endless. The taste of that smoky pork remains a powerful reminder of summer afternoons, family togetherness, and the simple joy of good food prepared over an open flame. Grits with red-eye gravy was the kind of breakfast that fueled families through cold mornings and long days of work or school. Grits were inexpensive and cooked into a smooth, warm base that filled the kitchen with a comforting smell. Meanwhile, mothers made red-eye gravy by deglazing a skillet of fat scraps with hot coffee, creating a thin, salty, smoky sauce that tasted far bigger than its ingredients suggested. The gravy soaked into the grits, giving them a sharp, invigorating flavor that woke everyone up instantly. Children ate it quickly, spooning it up while it was still warm enough to fog their breath. It was a breakfast that stuck to the ribs and kept bellies full until lunchtime. Even when the pantry was nearly empty, a pot of grits and a splash of coffee meant nobody went hungry. Mothers relied on this breakfast because it required almost nothing but offered so much: warmth, fullness, and enough energy to face whatever the day might bring. Many children remembered the smell long after leaving home, the scent of hot coffee hitting the skillet turning into a signal that it was time to get ready for work or school. It was a dish that said, without words, "You have something to stand on today." Grits with red-eye gravy was survival with a kick of courage. Cranberry orange gelatin mold was the festive centerpiece that sparkled under holiday lights, sitting proudly in its familiar metal mold on Christmas tables throughout the 1960s. Mothers mixed cranberry sauce, orange zest, sugar, and gelatin, pouring the mixture into molds shaped like rings, wreaths, or holiday designs. When it chilled overnight, it emerged glossy and jewel-toned, firm enough to hold its shape, but soft enough to melt on the tongue. Children loved the wobble, tapping the plate lightly just to see it jiggle before taking a bite. The flavor balanced tart cranberry with bright citrus, making it refreshing alongside heavier holiday dishes. Mothers appreciated that it required few ingredients, stretched far, and looked impressive without costing much. It added color to plates filled with greens, dressing, and meats, offering a sweet note between savory bites. This dish represented the creativity and pride mothers brought to holiday meals, transforming canned and simple ingredients into something festive and memorable. Even decades later, people remembered the cool sweetness and the joy of unmolding it just right. Cranberry orange gelatin mold tasted like holiday sparkles shaped by steady hands. Cheese wafers made with sharp cheddar and butter created crispy, salty crackers that children munched by the handful, their homemade quality far superior to anything store-bought could offer. Grandmothers would cream softened butter with finely shredded sharp cheddar cheese, then gradually add flour, salt, and cayenne pepper until the mixture formed a stiff dough. The dough was rolled into logs, wrapped in wax paper, and chilled until firm, then sliced into thin rounds and baked until golden brown and crispy. As they baked, the cheese melted into the butter and flour, creating crackers that were rich, savory, and addictively crunchy with just a hint of heat from the cayenne. In 1970s Black households, cheese wafers represented Southern tradition and hospitality, recipes that had been passed down through generations. Children loved cheese wafers because they tasted like cheesy potato chips but felt more sophisticated since they were homemade. Salmon croquettes were the breakfast of ingenuity, born from tin cans and imagination. Canned salmon was mixed with onions, cornmeal, and a bit of egg shaped into patties and fried until crisp. The smell filled the house like a promise that the day would be all right. They were crunchy on the outside, tender inside, and full of flavor that reached far beyond their humble ingredients. The sizzle of the skillet was music, the sound of a meal stretching to feed everyone. Eaten with grits, biscuits, or a little mustard on the side, they turned a simple morning into something memorable. These croquettes were survival disguised as comfort food, proof that scarcity never stopped creativity. They were hearty enough for men heading to work and tasty enough to make children smile. The golden crust caught the light just right, shining like victory in the pan. Salmon croquettes were a triumph of spirit and taste over circumstance. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Salted fish cakes were savory, pan-fried patties made from rehydrated salted fish mixed with mashed potatoes, onions, and spices. This preservation method had strong ties to African American and Caribbean cooking, where salted cod or other preserved fish were traded and transformed into flavorful meals. The mixture was shaped into cakes and fried until crisp on the outside with a tender, flaky interior. Often served with hot sauce or mustard, they could be eaten at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. The salty richness of the fish blended perfectly with the mild potatoes, while onions added sweetness and texture. In communities far from the coast, salted fish was a pantry staple that lasted for months without refrigeration. Fish cakes were an economical way to stretch limited protein, creating a satisfying dish that combined coastal preservation traditions with southern comfort cooking, delivering big flavor from simple, enduring ingredients. Smoked catfish tails reveal the skill and resourcefulness that defined survival cooking on plantations near rivers and coastal waters. After commercial fishermen or estate kitchens took the prime fillets, the bony tails and smaller pieces were often left behind. Enslaved cooks cleaned these scraps carefully, rubbed them with salt or local spices, and smoked them over slow hickory fires. The result was a flavorful preserved fish that kept for days and could be stirred into stews, crumbled over grains, or eaten on its own with cornbread. Smoking techniques reflected West African traditions carried across the Atlantic, where preserving fish with wood smoke had long been a way to ensure protein during lean seasons. In later years, African American fish camps and southern smokehouses continued this method, turning a food of necessity into a celebrated regional specialty. Modern smoked catfish dishes found in Mississippi and Louisiana restaurants still trace their flavor back to these early practices of careful preservation and culinary creativity born from scarcity. Flavor and a silky custard that made every bite feel like sunshine. A simple filling of fresh lemon juice, sugar, eggs, and butter baked into a single crust until the top developed a delicate golden sheen and the center set to a creamy, tangy perfection. The pie cooled to a gentle wobble that invited quick slicing and generous servings. Families loved how the dessert used basic ingredients yet delivered a sophisticated citrus punch, ideal for cutting through rich dinners or heavy holiday spreads. Lemon chess pie brought a welcome spark to church luncheons, family reunions, and Sunday suppers throughout the 1970s. Its zesty aroma filled kitchens with a hint of spring even in the heart of winter, offering comfort and brightness in equal measure. This pie proved that elegance could come from everyday staples, turning lemons and sugar into a memorable finale that refreshed the spirit and left guests asking for the recipe to share and cherish. Buttermilk pie wrapped simple pantry ingredients into a velvety. Potted meat and crackers were the kind of lunch that kept you moving when times were lean. A small tin held a salty, spreadable mixture that could be stretched across stacks of crackers or slices of bread. It was cheap, easy to carry, and filled more bellies than it had any right to. In lunch pails and brown paper bags, it was a steady companion to long days at the mill, in the fields, or on the road. Kids learned to love its sharp, smoky taste, mixed with mustard or relish when there was something extra to spare. It was not fancy, but it was faithful. In every bite was a story of making something from nearly nothing, of dignity and survival. Potted meat and crackers proved that lunch did not need luxury to carry pride. It only needed a little salt, a little grit, and a lot of heart. Some mixed it with chopped onions to make it stretch. Others used it to fill sandwiches that stayed soft until noon. The metallic pop of the tin opening was as familiar as the sound of morning rain, a promise that there would be food that day. It was humble, yes, but it never failed to do its job. Potted meat and crackers were lunch at its simplest and most sincere. Giblet stew over rice was a lunchtime staple that used parts of the chicken often discarded or overlooked. Giblets, hearts, gizzards, and livers were simmered with onions, garlic, and simple seasonings until tender, then poured over rice for a filling plate. The stew was deeply savory, inexpensive, and stretched easily to feed large families. Housewives liked the dish because nothing went to waste, and even a single chicken could provide multiple meals when every part was used. Children sometimes balked at the idea of giblets, but the flavor was rich enough to win them over, especially when smothered in gravy. Adults valued it for both its thrift and its nourishment, as giblets were dense in protein and iron. It was the kind of food that turned necessity into comfort, and it stood as a reminder that creativity often came from constraint. Today, giblet stew is rare at lunch tables, but once it represented survival and sustenance. Fried green tomato BLTs took a familiar diner sandwich and gave it a bright southern character that no one forgot once they tasted it. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until the coating was crunchy and golden, while the inside stayed slightly tart. They replaced or joined the usual ripe tomato slices between layers of crisp lettuce and smoky bacon, turning a standard lunch into something with a spark of creativity. Mayonnaise or a homemade remoulade added a cool creaminess that balanced the heat of the skillet fried tomatoes. These sandwiches were common in community cafes and roadside diners that dotted the South during the 1970s, where cooks knew how to stretch ingredients while keeping flavor bold. Packed into lunchboxes or wrapped in wax paper for road trips, they carried the scent of sizzling cornmeal long after they were made. Each bite captured a mix of crunch, smoke, and tang that called people back for another sandwich even when they thought one would be enough. Cornmeal sacks were as essential as breathing, and every family knew it. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and dependable, something you could use in a dozen different ways without wasting a single grain. Families used it for cornbread that stretched a pot of beans, hoe cakes cooked right on the stovetop, dumplings dropped into broth, and even as a thickener when soups needed to last another day. The sacks sat in corners of pantries, tied tight to keep pests out, often lasting weeks at a time because people used cornmeal daily. Kids learned early how to scoop it with steady hands. Knowing a little went a long way. Cornmeal was the base of survival cooking, humble but mighty. It kept families full when nothing else was guaranteed, proving that simple food could be powerful when stretched with skill and love. Buffalo tongue with sage was once a reward, a delicacy saved for elders or honored guests. It was not just meat, it was respect. Plains tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne honored every part of the buffalo. But the tongue, tender, rich, and layered with flavor, was something special. After a hunt, it was carefully cleaned, boiled for hours with herbs like wild sage, and sometimes seared by fire to lock in the taste. It was soft, slightly gamey, and soaked in meaning. This was not a casual weeknight meal. This was served with reverence. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who has ever tasted it, let alone cooked it. Buffalo herds have dwindled. Tongue meat, once prized, is now dismissed. People want boneless, skinless, bland, and easy. They shy away from parts of the animal that take time, that require skill. That is the real loss. It was not just the extinction of a recipe. It was the forgetting of how to appreciate something fully. Every part, every bite, that meal taught humility. And now it is gone, erased by preference, by modern palates, and by a hunger that no longer remembers where food really comes from. Pokeweed greens offered one of the first fresh tastes of spring for people living with few supplies after a long winter. Young pokeweed shoots emerged early and plentifully, but they carried natural toxins that required careful boiling in several changes of water. Enslaved cooks, drawing on African knowledge of wild plants, mastered this technique to create a tender, spinach-like dish that supplied vital vitamins when gardens were only beginning to grow. Seasoned with a bit of salt pork or a sprinkle of wild herbs, poke greens became a welcome sign of the changing season. Long after emancipation, poke salad festivals in Appalachia and the Deep South celebrated this once humble plant, turning a survival ingredient into a community tradition. The careful preparation taught by generations of African American cooks is still followed today, preserving both safety and flavor. Pokeweed greens remind us that deep botanical knowledge and patient cooking transformed a potentially dangerous weed into nourishing food that helped sustain families through the hardest times. Fried green tomato sandwiches were the color of summer held between bread. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in cornmeal, fried until crisp and golden, then layered onto soft white bread with mayonnaise or hot sauce. The contrast was everything: the crunch of the crust, the tart burst of tomato, the cool creaminess of the spread. It was a dish made when gardens were full and money was short, a way to turn abundance into comfort. Families cooked them in cast-iron skillets, the oil popping like applause as each slice browned. Served warm or cold, they were light but full of heart, a true Southern balance of tang and texture. Fried green tomato sandwiches were living proof that the simplest food could still taste like a feast when seasoned with care. They tasted of homegrown pride, of hands that planted, picked, and cooked from the same soil. You could hear the sizzle and smell the promise before the first bite even touched your tongue. They brought people together in kitchens and porches, laughter echoing over the sound of frying oil. Fried green tomato sandwiches were sunshine you could hold, bright, familiar, and made with love that lingered long after the meal was gone. Turnip and pea skillets were a flavorful lunch that stretched simple vegetables into something filling and thrifty. Diced turnips were fried with peas, often in pork fat, and seasoned with scraps of ham or onion to deepen the taste. The combination balanced the earthy bite of turnips with the sweetness of peas, creating a dish that was both hearty and satisfying. Housewives liked it because turnips and peas were inexpensive, easy to store, and versatile enough to serve alone or alongside bread. Children sometimes resisted the sharp flavor of turnips, but adults embraced the dish as both practical and nourishing. It was quick to prepare, making it useful for midday meals when time and resources were limited. Turnip and pea skillets carried the spirit of making the most of garden vegetables and stretching every ingredient. Though rarely seen now, they once reflected both thrift and creativity, proving that even modest produce could build a memorable lunch. Blackened shrimp lettuce wraps offered a fast and flavorful Gulf Coast lunch that felt light yet full of character. Fresh shrimp were coated with a bold mix of paprika, cayenne, garlic powder, and black pepper, then seared in a hot cast-iron skillet until the spices formed a smoky crust. Instead of bread, large, crisp lettuce leaves held the shrimp along with a spoonful of diced tomatoes and a drizzle of lemon butter, keeping the meal cool and refreshing. These wraps were perfect for hot afternoons when no one wanted to turn on the oven or sit down to a heavy plate of food. Street vendors in coastal towns often sold them wrapped in parchment for easy eating while walking near the water. In the 1970s, they represented a fresh take on seafood lunches, showing how tradition and innovation could meet in one simple dish. Every bite brought the taste of the ocean and the heat of southern spice, a combination that lingered pleasantly long after the last wrap disappeared. Homemade sausage and rice-stuffed tomatoes transformed garden produce into a full meal that was as beautiful as it was satisfying. Ripe tomatoes were hollowed out and filled with a savory mixture of cooked rice, crumbled sausage, onions, and fresh herbs. The stuffed tomatoes were then baked until the skins softened and the filling melded into a fragrant, cohesive dish. This recipe allowed families to stretch a small amount of meat across many servings while highlighting the vibrant flavor of summer tomatoes. Grandparents remember gathering the ripest fruit from backyard vines and sharing the excitement as the aroma of roasting tomatoes filled the kitchen. Served hot from the oven or cooled for a picnic, these stuffed tomatoes provided both nutrition and elegance without expensive ingredients. Each bite combined the sweetness of the tomato with the hearty richness of seasoned rice and sausage, creating a dish that captured the essence of resourceful Southern cooking. Even now, the memory of those bright red baked tomatoes remains a cherished part of family food history. Black-eyed pea soup was one of the most dependable winter meals because peas were cheap, nutritious, and able to stretch across multiple days. Mothers cooked them slowly with onions, seasoning, and scraps of bone or fat to deepen the flavor. As the peas broke down, the soup thickened into something hearty enough to anchor a dinner. Children gathered around the table with cornbread ready to dunk into their bowls. The soup warmed cold hands and filled hungry stomachs, offering comfort in every spoonful. Some families added rice to stretch it even further, turning one pot into several meals. The longer it simmered, the more the flavors blended together. Black-eyed pea soup did more than feed a family. It kept hope alive on the hardest days. Black-eyed pea soup was survival on the stove, steady and reassuring. Christmas morning grits with butter and sugar were the bowl children asked for, even before racing to open presents. Mothers cooked the grits low and slow, stirring them until the mixture thickened into something warm, smooth, and comforting. A spoonful of butter melted across the top, followed by just enough sugar to make the bowl taste sweet without overwhelming the grain. Children loved holding the warm bowl in their hands, steam rising into sleepy faces as excitement buzzed around them. This breakfast grounded the morning in warmth and love before the chaos of wrapping paper and gifts. It was simple, inexpensive, and dependable. The kind of dish that reassured mothers that everyone began the day nourished. Even as adults, people remembered the quiet moment before celebration, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of sweet grits. Christmas morning grits tasted like comfort and tradition waiting beneath the tree. Smoked oysters on crackers with hot sauce were adventurous bites that curious children tried. The smoky, briny oysters creating complex flavors that divided people into lovers and haters with no middle ground. Fathers would open tins of smoked oysters packed in oil, arranging them on serving platters surrounded by crackers and providing small bottles of hot sauce for those who wanted extra heat. The oysters had a strong, distinctive flavor, smoky from the curing process and intensely oceanic. Each oyster was placed on a cracker, sometimes with a tiny drop of hot sauce, creating bite-sized portions that delivered maximum flavor. In 1970s, Black household smoked oysters represented coastal sophistication and culinary bravery, appetizers that showed guests the host was willing to serve bold, distinctive foods. Children who tried smoked oysters either loved them immediately or swore them off forever, the strong flavor creating lasting memories. Hoppin' John was more than just a meal. It was a tradition steeped in hope and symbolism. Made from black-eyed peas simmered with onions, peppers, and pork, then served over rice, it was a dish prepared on New Year's Day to bring good luck for the year ahead. In African-American kitchens, especially in the South, the peas represented coins and the rice symbolized abundance, while the greens, often served alongside, stood for paper money. Smoked ham hock, bacon, or fatback lent a deep, savory flavor that turned simple ingredients into something rich and comforting. Families would gather around bowls of Hoppin' John, sharing not only food but the belief in a better year to come. Its origins trace back to West African culinary traditions brought over by enslaved people, blending with Southern ingredients to create a uniquely African-American staple. While it is still made in some homes today, the widespread observance of this tradition has waned, and many now know it only by name. Yet for those who keep it alive, Hoppin' John remains a flavorful reminder of heritage, resilience, and the power of food to carry meaning. Plates were cleared. Sweet potato pie carried the soul of family tradition to every holiday table, its earthy sweetness and warm spices making it an unshakable favorite. Roasted sweet potatoes were mashed to a silky smoothness, blended with brown sugar, butter, eggs, and a hint of vanilla and cinnamon. Poured into a flaky homemade crust, the filling baked until the surface set with a gentle wobble, and the scent of spice filled the house. Served with or without a dollop of whipped cream, it embodied the essence of Southern comfort and African heritage. In the 1970s, no Thanksgiving or Christmas felt complete without at least one of these pies cooling on the counter, ready to be sliced after a hearty dinner. Grandmothers passed down secret touches, maybe a splash of orange juice or a pinch of nutmeg, that made each family's version unique. Sweet potato pie was more than dessert. It was memory, history, and love baked into a single golden circle that brought everyone back for seconds and sometimes even breakfast the next day. Mulberry leaf wraps transformed young, tender leaves from the wild mulberry tree into clever edible packages. Foragers selected the freshest leaves in spring when they were soft and mild, then blanched them briefly to soften their texture. Cooked rice, seasoned vegetables, or small bits of preserved fish were spooned inside before the leaves were folded and steamed. creating tidy bundles filled with subtle, earthy flavor. This technique echoed African traditions of wrapping foods in leaves for both cooking and preservation, blending seamlessly with indigenous American practices. The result was a portable meal that required no extra containers and made use of a tree that also provided sweet berries later in the season. After emancipation, mulberry leaves continued to appear in Southern folk remedies and tea blends, but the memory of leaf-wrapped suppers remains a quiet testament to ingenuity. Mulberry leaf wraps illustrate how a single plant could meet many needs, offering nourishment, flavor, and practicality to communities that transformed every part of their environment into sustenance. Leftover smothered pork chops on white bread were the kind of lunch that tasted even better the next day. Packed in foil or wax paper, the tender meat soaked the bread with thick, peppery gravy until it became one with it. Cold or slightly warm, it didn't matter. The flavor was deep, comforting, and rich with memory. Families would save the last few chops from Sunday dinner and stretch them through Monday lunches, knowing that no drop of gravy should go to waste. The scent alone could stop conversation, that unmistakable mix of onion, fat, and love. It was the food of working people who believed in never throwing away what was hard-earned. Sometimes a slice of tomato or a drizzle of hot sauce joined in, turning a simple sandwich into something close to divine. It wasn't fancy, but it was soulful. A reminder that leftovers weren't just what remained, they were what endured. Leftover smothered pork chops on white bread carried the wisdom of generations who knew that comfort could travel anywhere, even between two slices. This humble meal carried the history of West African foodways and Southern resilience, proving that a dish born of necessity could be every bit as delicious as a costly feast. Each spoonful told a story of perseverance and community strength that still resonates for those who cherish these old kitchen traditions. Pickled pig feet with crackers offered a bold, tangy bite that was. Pig feet were scrubbed, simmered until tender, then soaked in a brine of vinegar, garlic, and spices until the meat absorbed a bright, mouth-watering flavor. Served cold, often straight from a large jar, they paired perfectly with crisp soda crackers and a glass of sweet tea. This dish was a common sight in neighborhood markets and corner stores where big jars of glistening pig feet invited passers-by to taste a bit of something special for just a few coins. Families appreciated how the vinegar preserved the meat, making it an easy meal to keep on hand during hot southern summers before widespread refrigeration. The chewy, savory texture and sharp bite of the brine became a taste of childhood for many elders who still speak of it with a mix of pride and nostalgia. Though rarely seen on modern lunch tables, the memory of that distinctive flavor remains vivid. Ham hock and collard soup cups were the kind of lunch that drew people from every direction the moment the aroma began drifting out of church basements and city markets. Collard greens simmered for hours with smoked ham hocks until the broth turned deep and flavorful, rich with a savory balance of salt and smoke. Volunteers would ladle the steaming soup into sturdy styrofoam cups that fit perfectly in a pair of hands, chilled by winter air. Each sip warmed the body and offered a taste of the kind of care that only long simmering can create. These cups of soup were inexpensive, filling, and easy to carry, making them a favorite at fundraisers where neighbors swapped stories while standing in line. In the 1970s, it was not unusual to see whole families gathered on the church lawn enjoying this simple comfort before heading back to work or school. It was food built from patience and generosity, a recipe that gave as much warmth to the spirit as it did to the stomach. Rumaki-wrapped chicken livers and water chestnuts in bacon created sophisticated bites that curious children tried, the crispy bacon exterior making them willing to taste the unfamiliar liver that turned out mild. Aunties would cut chicken livers into bite-sized pieces, marinate them briefly in soy sauce and ginger, then wrap them with water chestnut slices in bacon before securing everything with toothpicks. The bundles were arranged on baking sheets and roasted until the bacon crisped and rendered, the fat keeping the liver moist while adding smoky saltiness that transformed the organ meat into something special. As they cooked, the soy sauce caramelized slightly, creating a sweet savory glaze that coated the bacon. In Black households during the 1970s, rumaki represented culinary adventurousness, recipes borrowed from magazines that brought international flavors to holiday tables. Children who were brave enough to try them discovered that bacon really did make everything better. Candied sweet potatoes with marshmallows were a festive favorite, especially during holidays, layering tender sweet potatoes with a sugary glaze and melted marshmallows on top. The dish combined the natural sweetness of the potatoes with the soft, gooey texture of marshmallows, creating a dessert-like side that delighted many families. Sweet potatoes were an affordable and nutrient-rich staple, and adding marshmallows elevated the dish, making it special for celebrations such as Thanksgiving or Christmas. This recipe reflected both creativity and joy in cooking, transforming simple ingredients into a comforting and visually appealing dish. The sugary topping was often made from brown sugar and butter, intensifying the flavors and providing a caramelized crust after baking. Candied sweet potatoes with marshmallows were commonly served alongside savory dishes, balancing out hearty meals with sweetness. Although its popularity has declined somewhat, this dish remains iconic, embodying the warmth and festivity of family traditions and the inventive spirit of African-American home cooks. Smoked frog legs provided unexpected protein from the marshes and bayous surrounding many southern plantations. Skilled foragers caught frogs at night with simple nets or by hand, cleaning the meaty hind legs and seasoning them with salt and wild herbs before smoking them slowly over hickory coals. The gentle smoke preserved the meat for days and gave it a rich, savory flavor that paired well with cornbread or greens. This practice echoed West African traditions of smoking small game and fish to ensure longevity in hot climates. After emancipation, smoked frog legs remained a regional delicacy in Louisiana and coastal communities, later becoming a celebrated dish in Cajun cuisine. They remind us that survival often required deep familiarity with the waterways and a willingness to turn overlooked resources into sustaining meals. Smoked frog legs stand as an example of how necessity and skill created flavors that outlasted hardship, transforming what began as a pragmatic hunt into a distinctive part of Southern culinary heritage and a taste still enjoyed today. Ham hock beans and cornbread were the meal that filled bellies and hearts at once. Dry beans soaked overnight came to life in a pot of simmering ham hocks, onions, and bay leaves. The smoky aroma wrapped around every corner of the house, promising satisfaction long before the first spoonful. Served with a wedge of hot cornbread, it was food that stayed with you through the longest day. This dish didn't belong to luxury. It belonged to the hard-working, the faithful, and the patient. Every bean was soft, every bite of ham rich with flavor earned over hours. It was a dish made with time and trust, proof that good things waited for those who tended the pot. Families gathered around small tables with big appetites, passing cornbread and gratitude in equal measure. Ham hock beans and cornbread were the taste of sustenance, soul, and the art of stretching little into plenty. Fish head stew with vegetables was one of those meals born from the determination to waste nothing. Fish heads, often discarded, were simmered with onions, carrots, and potatoes until they created a rich broth full of flavor. The meat from the head was picked carefully, adding texture to the stew and stretching it further. Housewives valued this dish because it took what others threw away and transformed it into something filling enough for the whole family. Children were often squeamish about eating fish heads, but the flavor of the stew usually won them over once served with bread or rice. Adults appreciated the thrift and nutrition, especially when fishing provided a steady supply of inexpensive food. Fish head stew carried cultural memory too, tied to traditions of using the whole catch. Though uncommon today, it once stood as a symbol of making the most of every resource and turning scraps into sustenance. It slipped easily from the bone, then coated in a smoky, sweet barbecue sauce rich with molasses and vinegar. The meat was piled high on soft French bread that soaked up every drop of sauce, while a handful of crisp lettuce and sliced tomato added freshness. Vendors sold these sandwiches from street corners in New Orleans and from family-run cafes in cities across the South, and their popularity spread quickly through the 1970s. Each bite offered a perfect mix of tender meat, warm bread, and sauce that dripped down to your fingertips. Eating one demanded napkins and patience, but no one minded because the taste was worth every mess. They were affordable, filling, and unmistakably tied to the African-American lunch counters that defined the flavor of the decade. Sweet potato and black-eyed pea patties brought together two beloved Southern staples in a single hearty dish. Mashed sweet potatoes provided a naturally sweet base, while cooked black-eyed peas added protein and texture. Mixed with onions, garlic, and a sprinkle of cornmeal, the mixture was formed into thick cakes and pan seared in a cast-iron skillet until a crisp crust developed. The inside stayed moist and flavorful, offering a satisfying bite with every forkful. These patties were an ideal lunch for families looking to stretch ingredients while still creating something memorable. Grandparents recall how the smell of sizzling sweet potato filled the kitchen and how these patties were often served with a simple salad of garden greens or a dollop of tangy relish. They were not just economical but celebratory, proving that a meatless meal could be just as filling and festive as any meat-based dish. Today, their legacy lives on as a testament to the creativity and resilience of African-American cooks in the early 20th century. White beans with fatback were another long-lasting pot that carried families through the hardest weeks. The beans were soaked, rinsed, and started early in the day. A single piece of fatback was added, providing salt and richness that flavored the entire pot. As the beans cooked, they softened into something creamy and satisfying. Children loved dipping cornbread into the thick broth, soaking up all the flavor. The pot often lasted several meals, reheating well and growing deeper in taste each time. Mothers sometimes added onions or garlic if they had a bit left, but even plain, the beans tasted hearty. This meal did not require much money, only time, patience, and skill. In cold months, the steam from the pot fogged up windows and warmed the kitchen before anyone even sat down to eat. White beans with fatback were survival food that tasted like comfort and care. Peach cobbler with thick crust was the bubbling holiday dessert that made every child hover near the oven with wide eyes and impatient feet, drawn in by the sweet smell before they even saw the dish. Mothers poured sweet peaches, fresh canned or frozen, into baking dishes and covered them with a thick, buttery crust that baked into golden, flaky perfection. As it cooked, the syrup bubbled up around the edges, sending a warm, fruity smell through the whole house that felt like Christmas arriving early. When the cobbler came out, children begged for a scoop while it was still steaming, hoping for the corner piece where the crust was crispest. Families gathered around with bowls that warmed their hands, savoring each sweet bite. Peach cobbler tasted like sweetness, comfort, and Christmas joy wrapped in pastry, a dessert that defined holiday evenings. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Molasses-glazed ham hocks were a centerpiece of many family meals, slow-cooked until tender and coated with a rich, sweet molasses glaze that caramelized beautifully. Ham hocks, a tougher and more affordable cut of pork, were prized for their flavor and ability to infuse dishes with smoky depth. The molasses glaze added a distinct sweetness that balanced the savory richness of the meat and helped transform humble ingredients into a festive dish. Families often served these glazed hocks with hearty sides like collard greens, black-eyed peas, or cornbread, creating meals that were both filling and flavorful. This dish was popular during times when making the most out of every ingredient was essential, and molasses was a common sweetener available in many households. The slow cooking process allowed the meat to fall off the bone, making it perfect for sharing. Molasses-glazed ham hocks were more than just food. They were a symbol of community, celebration, and culinary resourcefulness that has sadly faded from everyday cooking. Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small-batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among southern sweeteners. Cane top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African-American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in southern pantries today. Collard greens with salt pork were a staple because greens grew cheaply, lasted through cool seasons, and could turn into a full meal when paired with even a small square of salted pork. Mothers washed each leaf carefully, removing grit and stems, then chopped the greens into pieces that wilted beautifully in a simmering pot. The salt pork, often nothing more than a strip of fat with a thin edge of meat, was added for flavor, melting slowly into the broth and transforming the dish into something rich and savory. The greens cooked for hours until they softened and absorbed every bit of seasoning. Children often asked when they would be ready because the smell filled the whole house long before dinner time. When served with cornbread, the greens became a full meal, providing nutrients and warmth in every bite. Mothers loved this dish because it was inexpensive but powerful, feeding bodies and spirits during long, difficult seasons. Collard greens with salt pork were the definition of stretching little into enough. Baked sweet pepper boats turned garden abundance into a colorful lunch that delighted both eyes and palate. Bright peppers were halved and filled with a savory mixture of cooked rice, diced pork, onions, and fresh herbs, then baked until the peppers softened and the filling turned golden. The gentle sweetness of the peppers balanced the smoky richness of the pork, creating a dish that felt festive without requiring expensive ingredients. Families often harvested peppers from backyard plots or traded with neighbors, making this meal a shared reward for the season's work. Grandparents recall how the kitchen filled with the scent of roasting vegetables while children waited eagerly for the first bubbling tray to leave the oven. Served warm or at room temperature, these stuffed peppers traveled well and were often packed into lunch pails for long days in the field or factory. Their vibrant colors and satisfying flavor made them a symbol of creativity and thrift, a memory of summer harvests and family togetherness that endures in stories and cherished recipes. Honey butter sweet corn on the cob was the highlight of countless summer festivals and neighborhood block parties, celebrated for its sticky sweetness and smoky finish. Fresh ears of corn were brushed with melted butter mixed with honey and a pinch of salt, then wrapped tightly in foil and set over open grills until the kernels grew tender and lightly charred. When unwrapped, the steam carried a fragrance that blended roasted corn and warm honey into an aroma impossible to resist. Children and adults alike lined up for these simple treats, which required nothing more than a napkin and an eager appetite. In the 1970s, farmers' markets and county fairs featured entire stalls dedicated to this dish, and families recreated it at home for backyard lunches and late-night snacks. The combination of natural corn sweetness and rich honey butter needed no extra seasoning, proving that the best festival food often relied on pure, fresh ingredients and a little patience over the fire. One bite, and the world slowed into pure summer delight. Cane syrup over cold biscuits was a lunch that turned leftovers into comfort. Biscuits left from breakfast would be split open and covered with thick cane syrup, soaking into the bread until sweet and sticky. It was quick, inexpensive, and satisfying, requiring nothing more than what was already on hand. Housewives appreciated this because it wasted nothing, stretching food into another meal without extra cost. Children loved it because the syrup turned plain bread into a treat, while adults valued the energy it gave when paired with coffee or milk. Cane syrup was widely available in the South, making it a natural companion to biscuits that might otherwise go stale. The dish was simple, but it represented practicality, turning scraps into nourishment. Though it might seem plain now, cane syrup over cold biscuits was once a beloved quick meal, a reminder that even leftovers could carry sweetness and comfort during hard times. Souse meat sandwiches were as old-fashioned as they were fearless. Made from pickled pork scraps pressed into jelly, sliced thin and served cold, they were a test of true Southern loyalty. The meat was tangy with vinegar, spiced with pepper and clove, and set firm from its own broth. Eaten between crackers or bread, it was salty, chewy, and deeply satisfying to those who grew up on it. For many, souse meat wasn't just food, it was heritage. It represented the resourcefulness of those who refused to waste a single part of the animal. Grandparents remembered boiling the cuts themselves, pouring the mixture into pans to cool overnight. The next day, they sliced it thin, proud of what their patience had created. Souse meat sandwiches were bold, flavorful reminders that history doesn't always taste sweet. It tastes real. It was a dish for those who honored where they came from, who understood that survival required skill and heart. Each slice told a story of endurance, of turning necessity into art. Even now, those who remember can almost smell the sharp vinegar rising from the kitchen, mingling with memories of family and perseverance. Souse meat sandwiches were not just lunch, they were living proof of strength. Okra and tomato stew with rice was the dependable pot of comfort simmering on many stovetops when the noon bell rang. Fresh okra pods thickened the stew naturally, while ripe tomatoes brought bright acidity that balanced the earthiness of onions, garlic, and bell pepper. A splash of homemade stock or even plain water was enough to create a rich broth once the vegetables released their juices. Served over a mound of steamed white rice, this dish carried the flavors of the Gullah Geechee coast into urban kitchens across the country. The gentle heat of cayenne or a pinch of smoked paprika added depth without overpowering the vegetables. Families loved it because it could feed many mouths from a single pot, staying warm for hours and tasting even better as the day went on. In the 1970s, it was common to see neighbors ladle generous helpings into bowls for visiting friends or for anyone who had come to lend a hand with household chores. Peanut butter and sorghum syrup sandwiches gave children a sweet reward that parents could still afford when sugar prices were climbing. Sorghum syrup, dark and rich with a subtle caramel note, spread smoothly over fresh bread and mingled with creamy peanut butter for a sticky treat that clung to fingers and hearts alike. This sandwich was packed into lunch pails headed for school buses and factory floors, offering long-lasting energy with ingredients that stayed fresh without refrigeration. Sorghum had deep roots in Southern farming, and in the 1970s it remained a pantry staple for many African American households that valued both tradition and thrift. The simple act of drizzling syrup over peanut butter turned a basic sandwich into something special, with each bite carrying a sweet depth far beyond plain jelly. Children traded halves with friends, and adults often sneaked a second sandwich for themselves, proof that the best lunches were not always the fanciest ones. Cabbage and potato cakes were a thrifty lunch born out of leftovers that would have otherwise gone to waste. Mashed potatoes were mixed with boiled or stewed cabbage, then shaped into patties and fried until golden on both sides. The cakes were served hot, often with a slice of bread or cornbread on the side to make the meal more filling. Housewives liked them because they transformed scraps into something satisfying, stretching meals when meat was scarce or too expensive. Children enjoyed the crisp outside and soft inside, making them easier to eat than plain cabbage. Adults leaned on them as a quick solution that required no new ingredients and could be cooked in minutes. The cakes symbolized a kind of frugality that did not feel like sacrifice, since they carried flavor, texture, and comfort. Today they have mostly disappeared, but at one time cabbage and potato cakes represented both resilience and everyday ingenuity. Creole crab cakes brought the flavor of the Gulf Coast to kitchen tables far from the docks. Fresh or freshly picked crab meat was mixed with breadcrumbs, diced celery, green onions, and a touch of spicy cayenne before being shaped into small patties. These were pan-fried in butter or lard until the outside turned a deep golden brown while the inside stayed tender and sweet. Families near Louisiana or along the coast prized this lunch when the day's catch was good, but even inland cooks used canned crab when fresh seafood was scarce. The gentle heat of the spices paired perfectly with the natural sweetness of the crab, making each bite a small celebration of coastal heritage and African-influenced seasoning. Served on soft rolls or beside a pile of greens, these crab cakes transformed a simple midday meal into something memorable. Elders who grew up with this dish often recall the sound of sizzling crab cakes as the happiest soundtrack of long summer afternoons. Cocktail meatballs simmered in grape jelly and chili sauce created sweet, savory bites that children couldn't resist, the glossy sauce coating each meatball like candy while delivering unexpected flavors. Mothers would brown frozen meatballs in skillets before transferring them to slow cookers or pots where they simmered in a mixture of grape jelly and bottled chili sauce that melted together into a thick, shiny glaze. The combination sounded strange but tasted magical, the grape jelly's sweetness balancing the chili sauce's tang and creating a flavor profile that kept people reaching for more. As the meatballs simmered, they absorbed the sauce and became tender, the exterior developing a sticky coating that made them perfect for spearing with toothpicks. In Black households during the 1970s, these cocktail meatballs represented easy elegance, a recipe that seemed fancy but required minimal effort. Children loved them because they were bite-sized, required no cutting, and tasted like a sweet, savory treat. Field pea and okra succotash was a colorful summer dish that combined the nutty taste of fresh field peas with the silky texture of okra and the sweetness of corn. Cooked gently in butter or with a touch of bacon fat, it celebrated the harvest season, bringing together vegetables that grew abundantly in southern gardens. African-American cooks often prepared it for family meals and community gatherings, serving it as a side or a light main dish with cornbread. The blend of textures, from the tender peas to the soft okra, created a satisfying balance, while the corn added bursts of sweetness. This dish reflected a strong connection to the land and the value placed on fresh, seasonal produce. As farming and home gardening declined, the tradition of making succotash with truly fresh ingredients became rarer, turning it into a nostalgic reminder of summer tables and garden-to-plate cooking. Brought dramatic color and smooth tang to every celebration during the 1970s. The batter, tinted with just enough cocoa and a splash of red food coloring, baked into striking crimson layers that contrasted beautifully with the snowy frosting. Cream cheese whipped with butter and powdered sugar provided a silky finish that balanced the cake's subtle chocolate flavor with gentle tang. Each slice looked like a piece of art on a plate, making it a favorite for church anniversaries, wedding receptions, and holiday feasts. The recipe's origins carried whispers of both Southern tradition and a growing national fascination with bold presentation. Serving red velvet cake was a statement of style and hospitality, a way to show guests that a little extra effort could create something unforgettable. Families treasured the excitement it brought to the dessert table, proving that a dash of color and a touch of cream cheese could transform a simple cake into an icon of joy and celebration. Coconut sheet cake was the chilled. Roasted chestnuts carried warmth and nourishment through the cold months when plantation rations were meager and gardens lay dormant. Enslaved families foraged chestnut trees that grew wild in the surrounding woods, gathering the smooth brown nuts and roasting them in hearth ashes or iron skillets until their shells cracked and the sweet flesh softened. The nuts' high energy content and natural sweetness made it an important source of calories and comfort, especially during long winter evenings. Roasted chestnuts became part of a wider African-American food tradition, appearing in holiday celebrations and roadside markets after emancipation. Their gentle flavor paired well with cornmeal breads and simple stews, and many families passed down techniques for roasting and storing them long after the plantation era ended. Today, roasted chestnuts sold at winter festivals and city street corners carry echoes of that history, reminding us that what began as a survival practice also nurtured community and seasonal ritual for generations who transformed hardship into enduring culture. cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the meal that stretched to feed anyone who showed up hungry. A whole head of cabbage cooked down in a pan with sliced smoked sausage, onions, and a little grease turned into a full, hearty lunch. The cabbage softened, soaking up the smoky flavor of the meat until every bite was savory and rich. It was a one-pan wonder. No waste, no fuss, just warmth and satisfaction. This dish filled bellies on cold days and made the kitchen smell like home. It was food that welcomed people in, proof that generosity wasn't measured in wealth but in how far a meal could go. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the definition of community cooking. Simple, soulful, and meant to be shared. The sizzle of sausage hitting the pan was the start of something comforting, a sound that said dinner would be all right. The meal carried laughter, conversation, and the kind of fullness that money could not buy. Even reheated, it was as good as new. Better, maybe, because the flavors grew deeper overnight. It was food that told the truth about love. Stretch what you have, share what you can, and feed whoever comes through the door. Salt pork and cabbage skillets were hearty lunches that filled tables with warmth and thrift. Chopped salt pork was fried until browned. Then shredded cabbage was added to the pan and cooked down until tender. The pork fat flavored the cabbage, transforming a simple vegetable into a savory meal. Sometimes onions or potatoes were added to stretch it further, but even on its own, it was filling and satisfying. Housewives valued the recipe because salt pork was inexpensive, long-lasting, and easy to store, while cabbage was available year-round and cheap. Children often found the flavor strong, but adults embraced it as comfort food that reminded them of both thrift and tradition. It was a dish that fed large families with very little cost, making it practical during hard times. Today, salt pork and cabbage skillets are rarely remembered, but once they represented resilience, creativity, and the ability to turn scraps into sustaining meals. Peach and cane syrup. Hand pies brought portable sweetness to lunch pails and picnic baskets, wrapping the flavor of ripe fruit in a golden crust. Juicy peaches were sliced and tossed with dark cane syrup and a sprinkle of nutmeg, then sealed inside rounds of flaky pastry. Baked until the crust turned crisp and caramelized at the edges, the pies released a perfume of warm fruit that tempted anyone nearby. They were small enough to eat without utensils, yet rich enough to feel like a full dessert, making them ideal for school children and factory workers alike. In the 1970s, these hand pies traveled from church bake sales to summer fairs, where their sticky sweetness drew long lines and happy smiles. Families baked them on weekends to slip into Monday lunches, knowing the flavor only deepened overnight. Each bite carried the deep Southern tradition of pairing stone fruit with dark syrup, offering a taste of home that could be enjoyed anywhere from a park bench to a bustling assembly line. Fried oyster po' boys brought the vibrant taste of the Gulf Coast to African-American lunch tables where seafood was both livelihood and celebration. Fresh oysters were dredged in seasoned cornmeal until every surface was coated in a golden armor that crackled when it met the sizzling lard of a cast-iron skillet. French bread loaves, crisp outside and airy inside, were sliced open to cradle the oysters along with sliced tomatoes and shredded lettuce for a cooling crunch. The signature remoulade sauce, a blend of mustard, paprika, and a hint of vinegar, soaked into the warm bread and tied every flavor together with a gentle tang. Street vendors and small cafes along Louisiana's coast became famous for these sandwiches because they transformed the morning's catch into a hearty portable lunch that fishermen and dock workers could grab between shifts. Grandparents still talk about the smell of frying oysters drifting through open-air markets and the thrill of biting into a sandwich that captured the ocean in every mouthful. The memory lingers long after the oysters are gone. Turkey neck gravy over rice was the thrifty holiday dish that tasted richer than anything store-bought, proving that skill mattered more than ingredients. Mothers simmered turkey necks with onions, celery, and spices until the broth turned deep and flavorful, stirring occasionally while the aroma drifted through the house. Once the meat softened, they thickened the broth into gravy and poured it generously over rice, creating a meal that felt comforting and complete even on a tight budget. Children scraped their plates clean, knowing this was one of those dishes that only appeared on special days. The gravy seeped into every grain of rice, turning something simple into something layered and rich. Turkey neck gravy tasted like resourcefulness, richness, and holiday care made from simple ingredients handled with love. Stewed squirrel with dumplings was once a common sight in rural kitchens, where small game played a vital role in feeding families. After a successful hunt, squirrels were skinned, cleaned, and simmered slowly with onions, carrots, and celery until the meat became tender enough to fall from the bone. Soft dumplings made from flour and lard or butter were dropped into the bubbling broth, soaking up the savory flavors. This dish was especially valued in the cooler months when fresh meat was scarce and every source of protein mattered. In African American communities with hunting traditions, stewed squirrel was as practical as it was comforting, turning a modest catch into a hearty, filling meal. The dumplings stretched the stew further, ensuring there was enough to feed everyone at the table. While many today have never considered squirrel as food, for those who grew up with it, the taste was familiar, mild, and satisfying, especially when paired with the soft, pillowy dumplings. It was a dish born from necessity, but one that carried a sense of home and shared effort. In the 70s, offering a dessert both hearty and refined. Fine cornmeal joined flour, sugar, butter, and fresh eggs to create a batter with gentle grit and warm golden color. Baked slowly in a heavy bundt pan, the cake developed a firm crust while remaining moist within, filling the house with the aroma of sweet corn and vanilla. A light lemon glaze or simple dusting of powdered sugar highlighted its natural flavor without masking its earthy character. Families appreciated how the recipe honored generations of corn-based desserts while embracing the pound cake tradition. Served with seasonal fruit or enjoyed plain alongside coffee, it provided comfort that felt rooted in history and hospitality. Cornmeal pound cake was a reminder of resilience and creativity, turning everyday staples into a treat worthy of celebration and proving that the most humble grains can yield something rich and unforgettable. Carrot pineapple cake combined the natural sweetness of carrots with persimmon seed coffee emerged when imported beans were rare or too costly for enslaved communities. Wild persimmons dropped their fruit in autumn, and the hard seeds inside were washed, dried, and roasted until dark and fragrant. Ground and steeped in hot water, they produced a warm, nutty beverage with no caffeine but plenty of comfort on cold mornings. This practice carried forward after the Civil War, especially during wartime shortages when coffee imports faltered again. Families across the South roasted persimmon seeds alongside chicory or other local substitutes, proving the durability of this inventive method. The gentle flavor and toasty aroma made it a beloved alternative long after necessity faded. Today, a few heritage festivals still brew persimmon seed coffee to honor the ingenuity of those who first discovered its rich taste. The drink reminds us that creativity in the face of scarcity can yield traditions that outlast the circumstances that gave birth to them, turning survival into a legacy of flavor and resilience. Mackerel patties were the fisherman's dream reborn from a can. Cheap and hearty, they started with canned mackerel mashed with onions, cornmeal, and egg, then shaped into rounds and fried until crisp. The smell was strong, the flavor stronger, a meal that stuck to your ribs and lingered in your memory. Dressed with hot sauce or mustard, it made a humble but mighty lunch. For families on tight budgets, mackerel patties meant protein without the price tag. They were quick to make, easy to stretch, and always satisfying. Even cold, tucked between bread or eaten plain, they carried the spirit of ingenuity. It was a dish that taught resilience, a reminder that good food came from creativity, not cost. Mackerel patties were survival seasoned with pride, the perfect example of how simple ingredients, handled with care, could feed both hunger and hope. Fried pig ear sandwiches were a lunch that turned overlooked parts of the hog into something flavorful and memorable. Pig ears were cleaned, boiled until tender, then fried until crisp on the outside while still chewy within. The ears were tucked into slices of white bread with mustard or hot sauce for sharpness. Housewives liked the recipe because it used cuts of meat that were inexpensive and often discarded, making them an affordable protein source. Children sometimes struggled with the chewy texture, but adults embraced the flavor and thrift. The sandwich was portable, easy to prepare, and filling enough to carry someone through the day. It reflected a tradition of honoring the whole hog, ensuring nothing was wasted. Fried pig ear sandwiches have nearly vanished today, but once they stood as a symbol of practicality and heritage, reminding families of how resourcefulness turned even the humblest parts of the animal into sustaining meals. Collard green hand pies were a traveling worker's best friend, easy to pack and even easier to eat on the move. Tender collard greens simmered with smoked meat scraps were chopped and seasoned with onions, garlic, and a splash of vinegar before being tucked inside pockets of flaky pastry dough. Once sealed, the pies were baked until golden, locking in steam that kept the filling moist and flavorful. These portable lunches were perfect for field hands, factory employees, and school children alike, offering a warm taste of home in every bite. Families often prepared them the night before so that a quick reheat or even a cold serving would satisfy hunger during long days away from the kitchen. The aroma of collards mixed with smoky pork carried a comfort that no store-bought snack could match. Each hand pie told a story of resourcefulness and pride in southern gardens, where greens grew abundantly and nothing went to waste. Today, they remain a cherished but rarely seen link to a simpler, heartier way of eating. Red velvet cake with cream cheese frosting was the Christmas showstopper, the dessert that made children gasp when it landed on the table because no other cake looked quite like it. The cake's deep red crumb contrasted beautifully with the thick, tangy white frosting spread across every layer with deliberate care. Mothers made it slowly and proudly, knowing it signaled a special occasion and that every slice would bring wide smiles. The flavor was rich, smooth, and softly cocoa-kissed, the kind of taste that stayed with you long after the plate was empty. It was usually saved for the very end of the day, when everyone settled down for one last bite of sweetness. Red velvet cake tasted like joy, pride, and a southern Christmas done right, a dessert that felt like celebration in every layer. Pone bread rose as the emergency staple when there was nothing in the house but cornmeal and water. Unlike cornbread that required eggs, milk, and baking powder, pone bread demanded only meal, salt, and liquid mixed into thick batter. The mixture was shaped by hand into flat cakes, then baked on hot griddles or directly in fireplace ashes until crusty outside and dense inside. This wasn't delicate food. It was survival bread that filled stomachs and provided energy when nothing else existed. In rural Black, traditional cedar-smoked beef skewers were one of those dishes that proved you did not need 1,000 ingredients to create something unforgettable. Beef was marinated with just salt, pepper, and maybe a brush of honey if you were feeling wild, then threaded onto wooden sticks and slow roasted over cedar branches. The cedar smoke wrapped itself around the beef, sinking deep into every fiber, turning a simple skewer into a feast that could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. You would find folks gathered around fire pits, laughing and trading stories while keeping an eye on their skewers, turning them every so often to get that perfect even char. There was something about the smell of cedar smoke that felt like a hug from nature itself, especially when it meant that dinner was almost ready. Kids would sneak bites straight off the sticks, adults would pile them high on plates, and nobody ever left hungry. And if you thought cedar smoke could work miracles on plain beef, wait until you see how mustard greens and ground beef teamed up for one of the most overlooked flavor combos in history. Red beans and rice plates were slow-cooked comfort served in generous scoops. The beans simmered for hours with bits of ham bone, garlic, and bay leaf, thickening into a creamy stew that filled the air with promise. Served over rice, it was a meal that could feed a family for days, stretching every dollar without losing flavor. It was lunch, dinner, and sometimes breakfast too, a dish that fit every moment of need. In Black kitchens from Louisiana to Chicago, red beans and rice were symbols of home. They carried the warmth of Sunday into every weekday that followed. Each spoonful was hearty, humble, and healing. Red beans and rice were not just sustenance. They were a story of patience, pride, and the unshakable rhythm of survival. Families would gather around the pot, stirring slowly and seasoning by feel, passing down the same technique through generations. Sometimes a splash of hot sauce or a side of cornbread joined the plate, turning simplicity into perfection. It was food that taught endurance and grace, a dish that said, "We will make it through." Red beans and rice proved that faith and flavor could coexist, simmered together in one pot until they became a way of life. Fried sweet potato sandwiches were one of those clever meals that turned a single vegetable into something substantial. Sweet potatoes were sliced, fried in fat until browned, and then tucked between slices of bread, sometimes with a drizzle of molasses or mustard. The result was sweet, savory, and filling, perfect for a quick lunch. Housewives liked the recipe because sweet potatoes were inexpensive, nutritious, and easy to grow in southern soil, making them dependable for large families. Children often enjoyed the sweetness, while adults valued the way the sandwich satisfied hunger without needing meat. Fried sweet potato sandwiches reflected a culture of thrift, using what was available to make meals hearty and flavorful. Though largely forgotten today, they once stood as proof that even a single vegetable could be transformed into a centerpiece of the table, carrying both nourishment and tradition with every bite served in mid-century kitchens. Barbecue. Rib-tip sandwiches turned an inexpensive cut of meat into a smoky masterpiece that defined roadside dining during the decade. Rib tips were seasoned with a dry rub of paprika, garlic, and black pepper before being slow cooked over smoldering hickory until the meat turned tender and the edges caramelized. The juicy pieces were chopped and piled onto thick slices of soft white bread or sturdy rolls that soaked up the sweet and tangy sauce. These sandwiches were sold from small stands along highways where travelers followed the scent of wood smoke long before they saw the hand-painted signs. In the 1970s, they became a lunchtime staple for workers and families who wanted a feast without paying a feast price. Every bite delivered a perfect balance of rich pork and sticky sauce, leaving fingers coated in a glaze that begged to be licked clean. It was proof that great barbecue flavor did not require fancy cuts, only time, care, and a good fire to bring the taste alive. Which forgotten weekly meal takes you back to the 1960s? Drop it in the comments, hit like and subscribe so we can keep bringing these lost traditions back to the tables that miss them.